Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Frank Quinn with Heritage Ohio, and welcome to today's webinar. Our webinars are brought to you as a membership benefit of Heritage Ohio, and the mission of Heritage Ohio is to help people to save the places that matter, build community, and live better. And today, it seems like I say this every month, but we've got a real treat with our webinar presentation. We have Dave Mertz from Belmont College, who is going to talk about historic paint colors. So just a few housekeeping items. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and type that into the questions box or into the chat box. And if you experience any problems with the webinar software, most issues can be resolved if you close and restart the program with the link that was emailed to you. If you're interested in the presentation or the slides, I'm sure we can arrange to share those with you after the presentation. Sometimes with our webinars, we have AIA continuing education credits, and we have those again for this webinar. So one of the fun things that we get to do with AIA credits is read over the learning objectives. So today we will learn why we paint historic buildings, and we'll learn the history of painting buildings. We'll learn chemicals used in paint and the lifespan of the historically produced paints in America. We'll learn how to identify and choose historically accurate paint colors for historic restoration through methods including microscopy, spectrophotometric analysis, and chemical analysis. And we'll learn about stylistic changes over time, paint availability over time, and color theory applied to choosing and using appropriate paints for historic buildings. Anyone who needs AIA credit, you can go ahead and email Pearl at pmabe@heritageohio.org, and we will take care of getting a certificate sent out to you for the credits. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dave Mertz. And Professor Dave Mertz serves as the director of the Building Preservation and Restoration Program at Belmont College in St. Clairsville, Ohio. And this is a post that David has held since the program's inception in 1989. The Belmont program is seen as a national model for trades-based technical education and historic preservation and has been copied across the country. Mr. Mertz has been an active participant, which I feel kind of strange calling him Mr. Mertz because he's always been Dave, but he's been an active participant in the development of historic preservation on a local, state, and national level. He served 4 years as the chair of the National Council for Preservation Education, which is a consortium of colleges and universities that offer undergraduate and graduate programs in historic preservation, and 4 years as chair emeritus. He has served on the advisory board of the Preservation Leadership Institute of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and on the editorial board of Preservation Forum, the nation's scholarly journal on historic preservation, and has authored numerous articles in national publications relating to trades education. He has served as a board member and vice president for both Heritage Ohio, which we are very happy to have his service, and also for the Ohio Preservation Alliance, Ohio's 2 statewide preservation nonprofits. Mr. Mertz currently serves on the board of the Preservation Trades Network and was just recently awarded the Askins Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the preservation trades. He is a graduate of Kansas State University with a bachelor's and master's degree in architecture and a certificate in regional and community planning. And Dave lectures frequently on building pathology and American architectural history. I think we've had him in that capacity for both of those, and if you attended either of those, you know that it was a great program. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce Dave.
Thanks, Frank. We'll go ahead, and hopefully we get a few minutes at the end if you have any questions. You can go ahead and ask them. Have the forward one, or I'll let you move it, Frank.
Yeah.
So the question today we're going to ask is why do we paint our buildings? The first, I divide it into two categories. The first one obviously is for protection from the elements. When we apply paint, basically what we're doing is forming a film on the surface of the wood that we apply it to, or in some cases masonry. And that's a sacrificial surface basically that's designed to repel water and other elements and to try to keep the material underneath, trying to make it last longer so that the building remains in good shape. The second purpose is to aesthetics. We can certainly add color to that paint film, and that is one of the main ways that we can introduce color into our buildings. You have to be point right here is you have to be kind of aware regarding local preservation ordinances when it comes to color. You want to check to make sure that the colors that you want to paint the building are certainly allowable by the local ordinance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. So, what makes up paint? Most paints are made out of three major elements: solvents, resins, and pigment. We call the vehicle the thing that basically puts the paint onto the wood is made up of solvent and resins, and then the solids in there are the resins and the pigment. There's good paints and there's bad paints, and if you're going to do, nowadays it's very common for people to paint their own buildings, their own houses, and be wary. Paint is one of those areas where there's a big difference between a high quality paint and a low quality paint. And I think this graphic kind of explains it pretty simply. If you buy a low quality paint, you're going to be buying a lot of filler and a lot of water, especially if it's a latex paint. The pigments are about the same. You get a little bit less pigment, but you got a lot less binder. And the binder is the thing that basically forms that film on the surface. And the less binder you have, the less life you're going to have in that paint. So a good high quality paint is going to have significantly more binder, a little bit more pigment, and significantly less filler. And thereby then is going to last a much longer time. Paint length also is affected by the type of finish on the paint in terms of what you're trying to achieve in regards to a sheen. High gloss paints tend to have much more binder in them than flat paints. We use flat paints and eggshells generally in the interior of the house or building. They're good for large wall space. The more binder we have, the easier it is to clean. And sometimes I'll put some fillers in that are designed to allow for easy cleaning. Most of our trim usually has a higher gloss on it, and we certainly probably want to have a little bit more gloss as we work outside. Let's look a little bit about the chemistry of paints. We don't have enough time. We've only got an hour. I could probably talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours about some of this stuff. But for today's arguments, we'll talk mainly about two types of paints: oil-based paints and latex or water-based paints. Oil-based paints are formed by cross-linking when the binder reacts with oxygen in the air. It takes a while for oil-based paints to dry, and it's one of the reasons why oil-based paints have been supplanted in recent years by latex paints or alkyds. Latex paints are basically emulsion type paints, where the particles of the paint are in a dispersion, a water dispersion. And when they apply it to the surface, the water evaporates off. And as you can see in the graphic, the latex spheres move closer together as they're left behind on the surface. And eventually they chemically react, creating a polymer film along the surface. That is an elastic film that protects the surface. Now we've got, when you compare those two, what are we looking at? Well, obviously with water, cleanup is easier. Everybody has access to water. With oil-based paints, you're going to have some kind of solvent. That's in most cases, a VOC, a volatile organic compound. Those are not safe. They're not good to breathe, and so water provides a safer method of painting, especially for interior surfaces. Some people still prefer, I'm going to skip over C and go to D first, priming with oil, because it does seem to provide a better surface from which to apply the final paint films. Priming is designed to make a bond between the finished paint coating and the material ultimately that it's being painted onto. I like priming with oil primarily because often on the surface of the wood are going to be nails. And if you try to paint with a water-based paint on nails, you're going to have immediate rusting of the nail surface, and you can end up getting spotting coming through your paints, rust spotting. So we always try to prime a little bit with oil initially. There's some issues in dealing with water-based paint over oil, and some of you might have heard of this before. You can paint oil over water as long as the water-based paint is dry. It's not usually an issue. But if you try to paint water over oil, and if the oil isn't completely finished curing, what can happen is that the water, the quickly forming film that the water-based paint creates over top of the oil can trap the unoxidized oil underneath, causing the oil to try to work its way through the surface of the water-based coating and become exposed, so that it can react with the oxygen. There was a case in Pittsburgh when I first moved here where a family came into a house, and they do what everybody does when they rent a house. They paint before they come in. And what had happened was that the owner of the property had painted with oil-based paint prior to them coming in. They came in, painted with a water-based paint over it, especially on one wall, and the wall started to bleed. Literally, you had small little areas where the oil kind of broke through the paint coating, and if you've ever seen linseed oil or main component oil-based paint, it kind of looks kind of brownish red, and it would just kind of drip down the surface then of the wall. It just so happened that they had put a cross on that wall with a statue of Jesus on it, and the local TV stations were there because they claimed it was a miracle, when in reality it was just simply somebody painting water-based over oil-based paint. There are others. There are alkyds that are more common paints nowadays to be used. And there's milk paints. Milk paints were historically used during colonial period of time. It's a combination of lime and milk, casein-based. The lime reacts with the milk, and it forms a binder that holds the pigment in place. If you've ever dealt with milk paints before, they are rather flat and sheen. They soak in a little bit. They have some qualities of a stain in that they will often distribute the pigment into the material a little bit, which makes them extremely difficult to remove once that's done. So don't ever paint with milk paint if you think at some point in time that you're going to want a natural finish on something. It's going to be very, very difficult to get off. And they were often then you would have to, almost a second step, paint a clear, if you wanted a gloss or some other kind of finish on it, you would have to paint a clear finish over top of the milk paint in order to achieve that level of sheen. Alkyds are synthetic resins that are made from fatty acids, and they become fairly popular in the second half of the 20th century as they begun to replace oil-based paints. They're set in a water base, which is great, and they set in about. Generally, if you can finish curing in about 18 to 24 hours, which is really nice. So, but you paint a coat, the next day you could paint a second coat on it. So there's some advantages to that. As far as fillers are concerned, and I suppose this is an issue that everybody probably here has had to deal with at one point or time if they're dealing with painting, is the idea of lead. Lead was used to increase opacity in the paint to make it seem thicker or denser. It had an insolubility in water, which protected the wood from moisture. And it neutralized acids, which tended to exist in the binders that made the film last longer, kept it from breaking down. So lead became, in the United States, the second half of the 19th century, lead became a standard ingredient, especially white lead, as you can see from the ads, a standard ingredient in paint, and up until about 1970, and especially during the early part of the 20th century, it was the wonder material, kind of like asbestos, and we know what happened with both of those. The little quote here that was, I think, from a 1920 or 1930 U.S. Forest Service statement that talked about the wonderful aspects of white lead in terms of using. There were two types of lead. There were white lead and there's red lead. Red lead was often used on things like barns as kind of a secondary nature. White lead was used for the lighter colors on buildings.
Plus, it was great at keeping mildew off the paint, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it's that ability to kind of keep the, to work on the acids and stuff. So, I mean, good lead paint. I mean, a good lead paint can last a tremendously long time. And that's why, sometimes even today, people are dealing with the fact that you may have a colonial revival or a craftsman home from the early part of the century, and you're just getting to that point. If you took care of that house and didn't put a lot of paint on it, but maintained it well, you may be looking maybe at having 3 or 4 coats of paint or more on top of that. And now if you're all of a sudden going in to take that off and trying to go down, you're going to be dealing still with lead paint. We've not totally gotten out of the lead. They knew that, it's like all these other things. They knew back then that lead was starting to cause problems or could potentially cause problems, but until other things developed that would take its place, they continued ultimately to use it. So if we look back in the history of paint, during the colonial period of time, paint was hand mixed on site. The painter would travel from community to community or from site to site. He would have a palette of powdered colors that he would carry on his belt or in his bag, and on site he would go ahead and mix those pigments in with either a milk binder, a caseum milk and lime binder, or eventually into an oil binder. You could use raw linseed oil, but it would take a long time to dry. If you boiled your linseed oil, it would certainly dry quicker. And the next slide shows an example of a pigment mill, basically, or a paint mill. The first one in the United States was a giant granite ball that, if you rolled it on the paint, the key to mixing pigments, even today, when you deal with milk paints, you're dealing with dry pigment, and you buy it. It comes in a bag, and you mix up what you need, because the biggest problem with milk paints is that they don't have a shelf life. Once they're mixed, that's you got a day basically to put them on, or they're going to be bad. So the painter would get it out, and they would want to grind up those pigments as fine as you can get them, so that they would mix thoroughly and disperse thoroughly in the binder or in the vehicle. And if you don't, and usually what happens is you mix it up and then you strain it. You want to get the clumps, it's like kind of like a cake batter in some ways. You want to get all the lumps out of it. And there's cartoons from 1736 that they're probably going to paint most of that way up through about the 1800s or so. The steam-powered mills came into effect in 1800. In 1804, the first white lead plant in the United States was created. So we started adding white lead at that time. The first varnish plant was in Philadelphia in 1815, just to give you some ideas of when things were done. And linseed oil was used as a binder in paint cans in around the mid part of the century. It was still used to mix with oils or to mix with paints earlier than that, but it wasn't used in the cans away until that time. There was a cultural revolution that occurred, and we'll look at this a little bit later on in the 1840s and 1850s regarding architecture in America. And we kind of flip-flopped from being very, very formal in a Greek revival, Roman revival way, to being very kind of, I don't know, I guess best you could say would be environmentally friendly. We went away from being a building houses and building buildings that were contrasting from the environment, contrasted with the environment, to building houses and coloring those houses in a way that allowed them to blend in with the environment. A.J. Downing, who was a horticulturalist by nature, wrote the book The Architecture of Country Houses. And I have that in here because what was important about the book was that it included the first paint chip ever included in architectural books. Architects and contractors and builders learned about architecture during this period of time. There were no architecture schools. They learned architecture by reading books and by traveling and looking at different things, and by working with practicing architects and contractors. And Downing writes this book, The Architecture of Country Houses, promoting this idea of building homes in the country in line with nature and cooperating with nature. And he introduces a line of paint colors that were different than what people had been using up until that time. And these were earth tone colors, the colors of fall, the colors of trees and the forest. And he put a hand painted strip in each book as a way to kind of give an idea of what color you should use. I mean, that tradition still holds true today. You go to a paint store and you grab a handful of paint samples, chips, and bring them home and determine ultimately what you want. If you find a copy, and there are some copies of this book originally out there, you can find one that's got the paint chips, the original paint chips in it. You got yourself a gold mine.
I was going to say, do they still, for the reprints, do they try to
no, not that one. No. Sorry. Today we have what we call, ready-to-use paint. And that was introduced to us in the United States thanks to a couple guys named Sherman and Williams from the Cleveland area who decided in the post-Civil War period that they were going to produce paint that would be ready to use and not have to be hand mixed on site. And when that happened, and a couple of years later, they came up with the idea of the resealable paint can. And when you put those two things together, all of a sudden, by the second half of the 19th century, the availability of colors improved dramatically. There was a lot of research going on into color and coming up with new pigments. The early colonial pigments were based on a lot of natural materials and naturally available pigments. Now we're getting into more chemically introduced pigments. In fact, I get the date here, Sherwin-Williams, 1875, developed the resealable can. The first ready-to-use paint was raw umber in oil. That was released in 1873. 1883, their competitor, Benjamin Moore, went into business. And in 1907, Benjamin Moore hired a chemist to work with them to develop new pigments and new paint samples. So it kind of shows you a little bit about the development ultimately of paint in this country. There's some of the logos from Sherwin-Williams.
The ubiquitous cover of the earth.
And you can imagine what happens when all of a sudden paint becomes readily available. Two major things occur. One is the availability of color and the need to have color. The second thing that happens is that you can do it yourself, and so the role of painting begins to shift slowly at first, away, from the painter to the potential do-it-yourselfer. That will become readily available in the 20th century, obviously, the ability to paint yourself. Probably the next major advancement was the idea of in-store mixing. When you went to Sherwin-Williams in 1880 to buy a can of paint, what they had on your shelf is what you had. That was it. It was by color. You picked what color you wanted, and that was it. Nowadays, we can go into a store and we can basically get any paint color. The chip on the back has a number on it. They plug that number into a computer. That computer then dictates what level of the different colors need to go into that paint, and you mix that paint. So technically, there is an infinite. I wouldn't say at this point there was an infinite, but there was certainly, for every paint chip sample that you have in Sherwin-Williams store, you now have the potential of having that paint. So they don't carry those anymore. They carry a base that then they mix the colors in the store and produce the paint that way. The last is the most recent is that the electronic matching. Today you can bring your green pen into that store and say, I want to match this color. They put it under a spectrometer and it's done. They can pretty much tell. Don't trust the apps in the phone yet.
Oh, really?
Because we've had some people who had apps come out and they've taken pictures of color and it's not quite, a lot of times not quite what it's reading. So I kind of stay away from that. But certainly the computers and things in the store are much more accurate in terms of matching specifically to that color. So today it's an infinite number of colors that are readily available to us today. An example of a modern day, basically, paint station in the store. Okay. So what do I paint? How do I paint? Or what options do I have available to me? Okay. The first I'd say is we can paint something that is period appropriate. And what I mean by period appropriate is that we're going to use colors that were common for that period of time in history. That allows the owner some flexibility. There's some people that just, I like yellow, or I like blue, or I don't like red, and to make them paint something exactly the way it was that the original owner had picked is sometimes not appropriate. And so by doing something period appropriate, they have some flexibility. They feel, like on a Main Street project or something, the owner feels like they're having some say into the choice of colors and not being forced to do something. And almost every major paint manufacturer today produces a line of paints that they would call their heritage colors or their national trust colors or appropriate colors for specific periods of architectural history. And so that's certainly one option. Here's some examples of some other period appropriate colors. Some companies that you might not have heard of, like Evercoat, Sirocco, and others. Aladdin was a ready-made, ready-kit house company at the turn of the century, kind of like Sears houses, and they had their own brand of house paints that they used. So, if you have an Aladdin house, you can do some research on the internet and find examples of paint chip cards and things that were available at that time, and you could get an idea of what colors would be appropriate ultimately for that house at any given period. For those of you that want to be more accurate and in a restoration, and you want the colors to be exactly the way the colors were at some period of time, you can do an analysis of that, or pay to have an analysis done. The picture on the left shows an example of a paint chip that there are two ways that we can mount paint chips. Here at the college, we usually use a tongue depressor that we use some hot glue and just put the paint chip in there. If you're looking for more permanent or long-term storage, they use a optically clear epoxy. And I've known people that have used ice cube trays and things that just put the paint chip in the epoxy and then cut the epoxy up to a small little piece then when it's done. And you have that, you can look at that under a microscope. On the right is what paint looks like under a microscope. And you can see the layers of different colors of paint there. What we would do with that, if we were doing what's called a color serration chart, would be then to take those paint chips and match them to the Munsell system or some other numeric color system that's out there. This allows us to take or identify that color based on a number so that we can write that in a report. So if the company that's doing this is in Arizona, they can write that in a report and they can send that to you here in Ohio or in West Virginia or wherever you are. And you can be able to take that in and match that to the Munsell system and get that color represented exactly the way that is.
So one thing, in looking at those, did they really have all the colors of the rainbow? When I look at that sample, it looks like, well, our two options were painting our house yellow or dirt colored. And
we're going to get to that. We're
okay.
going to get to that. Yeah,
all right.
It's coming up. The next thing we could do would be a spectrophotometric analysis, which is kind of what happens in the paint store anymore, but you can get tools that you can go out there and you can match. Basically what it does is it reflects light off the surface and it matches the paint by that way. The final way is to use a chemical analysis, which would be the highest dollar approach to paint analysis, where they would go in and they would break down the paint based on the components of the paint, the chemical components of the paint, and they'll tell you not only what color it was, but they'll tell you exactly what they use for a pigment, exactly what they use for a binder, all that kind of stuff. But you're going to pay kind of a lot for that. Okay, so now you know a little bit about paint, and you know a little bit about the options regarding how you select or potentially select paint. So how do we apply ultimately what we've learned? Okay, this comes to your question, Frank. Okay, what color do I paint it? Typical color wheel. Okay, you've got your three primary, your three secondary, and then you have your tertiary colors. Okay, the idea is that something opposite the color wheel, in this case like blue and orange, go together. They're opposites, and so they set each other off. Right, Christmas is red and green. Right? There's a reason for that. Okay. The Minnesota Vikings are purple and yellow. I mean, a lot of you look. I mean, if you look at this and you start comparing this, you see, the Broncos are blue and orange. A lot of these things are used in everything that we do, and it's important ultimately that you understand it. We talked about the Munsell system and the idea that starting with a color or a chromatic version of a color, I can take a color from that color wheel and I can add a clear liquid to it, which would dilute it down. Okay, make it softer from that standpoint. I can add black or white to it to change its value. Okay, so I could make it a deeper color or a lighter color, and that's really what the Munsell system does. Is it does these things on very, very succinct steps, so you can look at it. From that, you would develop, and this is kind of the key, I suppose, in terms of what we're going to talk about. You can start to develop sample cards or sample palettes of which to use of different colors that work together. In buildings, okay, first major lesson today, in buildings, you're going to have a body color, you're going to have a trim color, and in some instances you may have a highlight color. Okay. Let's look at an example of a building. Here's an ornamental cottage. And you can see right there that the tan is used as the body color. They use the green as kind of a trim color, and then beige is used as a highlight color in a few different areas. You don't want to use the highlight color a lot. You want to use it just a little bit to highlight certain areas and to bring certain areas out. The body color should be the dominant color. You asked earlier about color. During earlier colonial periods, they didn't use any color on buildings at all. It was considered by the Pilgrims and others to be a sign of wealth, and it was inappropriate to use color. But by the 1700s, you began to see the use of colors on buildings, and there were basic colors that they used at the time, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. Here's another example of another palette. This was a little more complex palette, and this is obviously at a what you would consider probably a Princess Anne or the Queen Anne at that time, and so this is a building that was appropriate for it's a George Barber house that would have been appropriate in the 1880s, 1890s, when color was readily available. So now I'm going to get a few more. It's okay to get a few more highlight colors in there. Maybe the window's a little bit different than others. Consider the roof as part of the color palette also, something to think about, especially if the roof is readily visible. But as we'll see later, you're still not going to get 60 colors in there. You know, we're going to keep it. They're going to keep these palettes relatively simple. Now, one way that you can do these color schemes is if you can get an elevation of your house and look at it. You can get a picture made. Nowadays, with everything that you have in your phones and on cameras and stuff, you can take a picture of something, turn it into a black and white line drawing, and then take out some colored pencils and start playing around to get a sense of what the building might look like ultimately when you paint it. Sometimes people, the wonderful thing about it is, you know, in a study like this, it works great, but some people sometimes can't imagine what a color is going to look like, and they'll pick a kind of a more bolder, more modern color, thinking that it looks good, and then they go out and they paint it on the building, and it's garish because it's too much, right? You know that. So, you know, you could do even a simple study like this of you know what's it going to look like around the window, and you can just carefully play around with a variety of different colors to get an idea of what might be appropriate if you're just looking to do that. So let's look at some stylistic trends in painting. During the Georgian and Federal period, white was a popular color, and they typically used green or black for shutters. High contrast situation ultimately there, and the door. The front door would usually be painted color, and sometimes even red for the front door, because that would really show that you were somebody ultimately at that time. It was okay to do that. The body colors also would be some bold colors, like here at the Vassal Longfellow House. You have this, you know, nice bold yellow color that's used as the body. White is used as the trim. You really don't have a high. I guess you could argue that the highlight color would be the green of the shutters in this situation. So all your trim work is white at that time. Part of that had to do, as we'll see a little bit later, with interest in Greek and Roman architecture, and you begin to see some of that occurring here in the Vassal Longfellow House. As we move over, a lot of masonry buildings exist at that time, and in masonry buildings, the trim is either going to be typically white or beige. Especially if it's a stone building, you might see it match and blend in to try to make it look like stonework, and maybe just a little bit of highlight around the door, as you're seeing there. Another example, this is another kind of off yellow, off white color as the body of the building, and once again all the white trim, everything white around it. So we move into the Greek and Roman Revival period. You know, buildings, masonry buildings would have white trim. You don't see much difference ultimately in this period. If you had a wood building, some blues, some kind of colonial revival blues or Greek revival blues would come up, and yellows again, some deep colors. But in a masonry building, this is a Monticello, you're going to have white. And, you know, white is going to be the primary trim color. And in fact, white became the primary color for buildings altogether. And you're doing the entire building in white. In fact, there are people that wrote, letters back to Europe that, walking around America and all the buildings are white. All of them look. Part of it was our love for Greek and Roman buildings. And at that time, as archaeologists were uncovering this information, these buildings, which traditionally would have been painted, all that paint had fallen off, and they were appearing to be white marble, white stone buildings. And so we kind of mimicked that white, but the reality of it is, in the end, that they weren't. Stucco buildings, like the next picture here, at the Scarborough House in Savannah, would typically be done in a stone color or a white all-around color. You don't see during this period a lot of no highlights per se at all. Very much a body color and trim color being the same, or if it's a masonry body like brick, you would have a trim color. And then we get into this downing time, this kind of Gothic revival time, where where attitudes changed as far as color was concerned. And so we're going to paint the house, the body of the house is going to be painted a color that's going to kind of blend with the environment. So the earth tones, the browns, the more ochre colors, umber colors, those kinds of things are going to be the body of the house, with a white or a beige, or even in some instances a dark trim. They come in with a deep brown or chocolate trim, as we'll see here in a little bit. Another example here, kind of a dark gray, greenish color, kind of as the background. Next one. This is a great example, kind of a green, kind of soft green background with a dark green trim with a little bit of a beige highlight color on it. And that's using a dark trim color from that standpoint. The next picture is practically the same house, painted in a different way. Okay. In this case, with a dark body color with a white trim color. I personally prefer the other one, but certainly these were both doable ultimately at that time. At about the same time, the Italianate houses become popular. There's a lot of woodwork that's coming out, and brackets, and everything's coming out due to the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing and the ability to distribute all this stuff by train. And we see, in this case, a dark body color with a white trim color. Next one. This I got off of one of the paint company sites. It's using red. I think a little bit too much of it, but a yellow background with a white trim. This is more of an urban building. Some would argue there's maybe a little too much red in there at that point, but it's an example. And the next one is an example of a more commercial building. That may seem garish to some of us. I mean, that's 5 or 6 colors ultimately mixed together or used on that building. It represents a period of time when that was doable. And I wouldn't probably recommend that if you were going to go do something, because the amount of time to maintain that is going to be considerable. Every color you add, think about that, it's going to add to the price ultimately of the job eventually, and you're going to have waste and other things left over.
I understand that we're having some audio issues, and it looks like our picture might have just disappeared and then came back on. We're going to work on trying to get that taken care of, but please just bear with us as we go on.
When we get into the Victorian, the late Victorian era, the Second Empire, and between the main houses, most of these tend to be, bodies still are earth tone colors. They seem to work best. A little darker with the trim for Second Empire usually. Second Empire will often have polychromatic roofs showing. What I mean by that is I may use different color slates because you can see that aspect of it. The Queen Anne period is probably the grand era of house painting, I suppose, in this country. And by this time you have can paint available from Sherwin-Williams in a wide variety of colors. And it's like anything else, today. You all of a sudden, if something becomes readily available and inexpensive to you, everybody has to go out and have it. And so people were painting their colors in their houses, a variety of different colors. 4 or 5 color paint schemes are pretty typical. They will match usually the materials that they're being painted on. So in Queen Anne homes, it's not unusual to have 2 body colors because you might have 2 body materials. You might have clapboards on the first floor and scallop shingles like on the lower picture on the second floor. And in some instances, people will choose to paint those different colors, and that's an acceptable approach. All the colors should work together ultimately and should be readily available or be appropriate ultimately for that time period. The picture that I start out, that everybody, when you talk about Queen Anne's, they think of the painted ladies of San Francisco or buildings that have, and I know in Manhattan, across from my fraternity house, there was a Queen Anne house when I was in college. And people started at the top, and their goal was to paint, I think, every shingle practically a different color. I mean, they were using a tremendous number of paint colors, and that's not what Queen Anne paint schemes are like. That had more to do with LSD in the 1960s in San Francisco than it did with appropriate colors for Queen Anne house. Our early 20th century revivals, something like a Tudor house might have the colors of the brackets or the timbers, either a dark or chocolate brown or a green green color like this, where the inset is a lighter color. That was very typical. Colonial revivals will often have a standard body color or brick, and then have a back to the white highlight color. The commercial buildings. This is first slide is what kind of not to do. This is what happens when you. This is what happens when you go to Kmart and buy a blue light special in terms of paint. You go out there and I think all the people in front of the building are very proud of the fact that they just painted it. But we don't paint stone lintels and stone sills fluorescent green. I know here and locally there's in a local town somebody did that one year. They decided they were going to paint their building a fluorescent color to draw attention to it. And they certainly did draw attention to it, but not in a good way. It doesn't help those around you. It certainly doesn't help you if you do that. And so this is why we do have color selection as part of a design review board's responsibilities to make sure that, not that we want to dictate what color you're going to paint your building, but we certainly want to make sure that what you paint, what you pick, is at least appropriate and not doesn't go against what everybody else is doing around you. More appropriate approach for a commercial building, and most commercial buildings are masonry. And so whether you have a sheet metal cornice that would need painting, usually it was either you did that in white or you did that in a beige color to try to match the stonework. The color in masonry buildings often comes, the highlight color often comes from the other attributes that are associated with the building. In this case, like the awnings. The awnings become a perfect place to introduce color into the building without having to go in and paint the building an odd color, so to speak. The windows are usually painted, if they're wood windows or even if they're replacement windows, the colors are usually designed to be compatible with the masonry. Art Deco, occasionally run into some Art Deco buildings. Art Deco is a little different. It's another change again in our kind of color theory. Art Deco was popular in Florida, and it was popular in California. These are two areas that were really growing at that time. And they tend to use the color of the beach and of the Southwest. And so you're going to, pastels became very, very popular at this time. So light pinks and light yellows and light blues, like sky blue and stuff, became very, very popular colors. for these buildings. Prairie-style buildings, the whole right thing was to be one with the earth, and so they're very earth tone related, and often a light body color with a dark trim color. Usually chocolate brown or Cherokee red or forest green. These are the colors that light typically use ultimately in these buildings. Getting near the end here. Bungalows and craftsmen, they took the cues usually from the materials that they were built with sometimes, and also of readily available colors for that area. So this is an example of the Cheyenne house up in East Aurora, New York, which is painted basically 2 shades of green, a very dark green for the trim color and a little bit lighter green for the body color. They work very well together, and it blends in very well with the environment. It goes very well with brick. Another East Aurora house, but this time using a very light colored stone, and so white was the appropriate choice ultimately there. In some ways you can't go wrong with white. Some of these early craftsmen, in this case a 4-square home, often did have 2 material colors, and so, or 2 types of materials, and so once again a clapboard on the first floor painted yellow. The shingles, basically on the second floor here, painted brown, kind of a brown, and then using a white as highlight, or as a trim color throughout the building. So here's another example of a deep color, trim color, and then the highlight. In this case, the window sash is painted a highlight color. So the trim is white, but the sash is a darker color than the actual body color of the building. So, in conclusion, stay true to the design of your house. Okay? If you don't paint a Gothic house white, a Gothic building white. You don't paint a Greek revival home forest green. So stay true to the style design of your house. Body, trim, highlight when appropriate. Okay, try to keep it simple. The best way. Was it the KISS principle? Keep it simple, right. Stupid. And finally, with earth tones, it's kind of hard to go wrong because most of our colors are derived from nature, and so most of the colors used in the history are derived from nature. There are examples here and there of more bolder, brighter colors, but those are usually more appropriate for standalone houses on estates, and not so much in a neighborhood where there are a lot of houses. So, you don't do this. Okay, which is, wrong in so many ways. Don't paint yellow smiley faces on a purple house. And certainly, you can imagine what happens to property values on either side of somebody who ultimately does this with the property. So, and that applies in a commercial district as well as it applies in a residential. So, questions?
Great. Thanks, everyone, for bearing through with us with our technical difficulties that we have. Feel free to ask us questions. One of the things, Dave, that you brought up was the whole design review and colors as legislated part of that design review. So if a design review board was coming to you today and they're like, how little or how much should we be legislating or worrying about paint colors, what would be your advice to them?
I would try to give the owner some freedom, and best thing to do is to maybe assemble a palette of colors that the design review board would feel is appropriate, the basic colors that they would feel appropriate, and then give those to somebody coming in ultimately, and allow them then to try to find something that is in those ranges or in that area, so that they feel like they're a part of the process. The worst thing I think a design review board can do is act like they're the judge of the color judges or something, and to allow the owner to participate in the process is essential to getting buy-in down the road. And so, you don't want to say no.
Right.
You don't want to get yourself in a position to say no. So be proactive from the front and say, these are colors that that are appropriate for a building of this age, of this style. Why don't you look at these colors, and if you find something that you like or close to something that you like, we can explore a little deeper, that color, and hopefully come to some conclusion, some happy solution ultimately that everybody's ultimately happy with.
Okay. And we do have a question about, actually there's a few questions, so we'll work through them one at a time. Are there regional preferences for paint colors based on certain architectural eras, such as Victorian architecture in the Midwest versus on the East Coast?
There's I wouldn't say there are regional differences per se. There's stylistic differences a little bit. So, the term Victorian is a very, very broad term, and it is usually inclusive of a variety of different styles ultimately that come out of that. And certainly within some of those sub-styles, there is some differences ultimately in terms of color. For example, shingle-style houses that usually are classified into the Victorian period relied on the fact that they didn't paint. They went back to kind of the colonial era of naturally exposed shingles, gray shingles. Whereas in the Victorian, by that time, thanks to the train, thanks to rural free delivery and catalogs, regional differences had begun to disappear completely. And the craftsman movement of the early 20th century is actually a revolt against that lack of regionalism, that nationalism that was going on ultimately in the last quarter of the 19th century. Be true to your area, be true, use stone and rock and other things that came from from the local streams, the local fields and stuff, and build your house yourself kind of mentality. And so where you might find some regional differences in craftsman colors and stuff, and craftsman materials, I shouldn't say colors, but materials, by Victorian period, by the fourth part of that century, now it was you want that shade of green in San Francisco, you can get that shade of green.
We had a question. You discussed the paint analysis, the various methods, and that the Cadillac of paint analysis was going to cost you. So Joyce is asking about an estimate.
I have not had one done recently, Joyce, so don't hold me to that, but I would not be surprised if it's in the 5 digits.
Oh, really?
It's taking Frank some time because he's looking basically one line at a time on anybody's questions that are having 4 or 5 lines long. Trying to figure out how to.
I am not the webinar expert. We are joined today by Pearl, who is our AmeriCorps volunteer, and actually Pearl will be taking these over in 2015. And I have a question here. If the job is prepped and painted correctly, how long should the paint job last on average?
Today, I would say that you're probably looking at 7 to 10 years. Okay. Pretty safe. In some instances, what's going to happen is the paint or the house is going to age differently depending on what side of the house is exposed, to the weather. And so your west sides and your northwest side are probably going to weather quicker than maybe your south side, especially more than your east side. At what point in time, we didn't get into paint deterioration, we could have gotten into that, but it wasn't part of the webinar. But if what's going to happen with paint is if it weathers perfectly, eventually what will happen is it will turn to dust. The binder will simply wear away, and the pigment will be there. And if you can go up to your paint, and you put your hand on it, and it comes away, and your hand's like white or lightly colored, that's a time. It's time to repaint. That's reached its usable life, and it's gone. More often than not, what's going to happen is that the paint film is going to start to fail at some point, and either you're going to get water issues or moisture issues, in which case the paint starts to blister and then peel, or you're going to have issues with ultraviolet radiation, ultimately drying out the oils. It's very typical for oil-based paints to start to alligator crack. If you look on the surface, you'll see fine, uniform cracking lines. It forms like the back of an alligator, it looks like. And what's happening there is the paint shrinking. The paint film shrinking. It's losing its elasticity. And so you're developing stress within the paint film, within the elastic coating of the paint film, and it cracks. It cracks uniformly. Kind of like what happens when you get a sunburn. You get a really bad sunburn. And at that time, eventually those pieces then will start to curl, and then they will fall off as chips. Now, when it starts to crack, it's a sign that you reached your usable life, and it's time to repaint. Can you repaint over? Yeah, if you're properly prepared, you can paint over. You don't have to strip down every time, but every time you add a layer of paint, what you're doing is you're going to reduce slightly the length that paint's going to last. Because what happens is the paint bonds to the paint coating underneath it, and it keeps getting thicker and thicker, it loses elasticity. Think about putting, if you put caulk on something, you put a thin layer of caulk on, it's got to be very thin so it stays elastic. It's got to be thick enough to bond to the surfaces, but thin enough to stay elastic. If you just load a big ball of caulk into something, it may stick, but it's not elastic anymore. And as soon as anything moves, it's going to just break off on one side or the other. And that's ultimately what's going to happen in paint. So you keep adding paint coats, what's going to happen is your lifespan is going to reduce over and over and over, down to a point where it makes sense to go ahead and strip everything down and paint from scratch.
Would you like to say something about the tradition of porch ceiling colors? And this is also coming from Joyce. I'm guessing porch ceilings traditionally painted in blues, maybe?
Blues and grays, colors of sky was not unusual at that time. What's the purpose of the porch is to be cool. Blues traditionally have a cooling effect. You get into color theory, color theory. Reds and oranges are warm. Yellows are warm. Blues and greens and grays are cool colors. And so when are you going to use your porch typically? When you're hot in the summertime, you're going to be sitting out on the porch, so not unusual that would be done that way. The other aspect of it too is a lot of more naturally finished. If you had a wood, a board ceiling, that it would have been varnished or shellacked.
Great. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. I received a comment from Jana regarding the AIA credit. And Jana, if you just contact me directly, fquinn@heritageohio.org, then we can take care of the continuing education credit for you. Let me go ahead. I'll go ahead and put my email in there in case you have questions about that or anything else. So thank you so much, Dave. It was illuminating hour on paint history and getting into just a little bit of that preparation and painting. So I hope you all will plan on joining us. In just a couple weeks, we'll have our last webinar of the year in early December. We'll be looking at tourism, heritage tourism, civic tourism in the state of Ohio. So I hope you will plan on joining us for that. Until then, have a great day.